We have 10 minutes and my fingers are stiff, not sure how much I'll get done. My space bar is also sticking, so all in all I'm not holding my breath. We were at water's edge. I tried to stay below the canopy, to experience the forest as I would trees. The experience was a new one, again a different way in and out of swimming in kelp, becoming kelp. Can humans ever become kelp? Tumbling around caused nausea, a vertiginous swirl in the brown fronds, everything shifting. My centre didn't hold. It's been so long since we have written and swam together, although we swim together all the time. I'm trying to understand what swimming writing does differently. We are all writing now. I cannot wait to see what Tammy and Viv have written. It's like sharing photos after the swim, different takes in the same pool, drawing from the same pool. Always a drop, drip, snippet of shared experience. Thinking about the upcoming webinar and wondering how to contribute, what our contribution might offer. I know how much this practice matters to me, to us, but I don't know how it can be interesting to others. My fear is that when we show our piece, that the other participants might feel excluded, much like visiting the aquarium and watching, looking, observing through glass. Is it possible to expand this practice, or is this an exemplar of how swimming writing together expands our practice of doing academia differently?
What does it tell us about making knowledge that goes beyond the Cartesian logics of scholarly traditions, but also histories and current capitalist logics of extractivist and representational research? How does it help us also do a scholarship that can make some difference and shake up the current challenges we are facing, rather than reproducing relations of power and privilege, which is the default of academic knowledge? We are arguing that swimming in the sea makes possible not only alternative ways and methods of knowing, but also allows a confrontation with the ghosts of past and future. You take a thought to water like those who do walking methodologies take a thought for a walk. Sometimes you find new insights, aha moments. Other times you do not even think about what you set out to think. Yet the thought, the problem, seeps into the narratives you make after. The wonder of the creatures we see and who come into our vision, startling us, inspiring us, our relationality, a deep respect for their separate lives, and yet deeply related ones, are inspired. We are always surprised by how our narratives speak to each other, both in what we notice in the water, the colors, the currents, the creatures, but also in terms of what thoughts flow through our narratives.
Swimming every day, more than I did when I was going into work at the university, and being away from those tedious, toxic, rule-obsessed meetings, I feel more and more impatient with things that I was coerced to do, but should feel liberated from, but don't always do.
I increasingly fear that I'm losing my curiosity for academic language, that I would rather just be in this body and mind and heart and live simply and ethically than to write about it or attempt to bring it into a legible format. But how else does one contribute to making a difference without packaging it for human consumption and affirmation, which inevitably implicates one in the very logics that we critique and reject, caught between fraught pools and tensions, the tides and currents, the inevitable sight and sensibility of being human and yet wishing to make a difference, to make a splash, or be splashed, or be a splash that disturbs the normativity and its violences, that brings fresh salt and water and organisms and life and color and beauty into the pool, to refresh and to sustain, to make and remake, to keep the flow and harmonies before another flash or splash, sometimes maybe even a crash, is necessary. We are all smitten with the octopus, her deeply caring and affecting grooming of the thousands of eggs she makes, the intriguing facts of so many hearts and so many brains, and so much fluidity of color and shape and texture. And yet we also know that she's capable of strangling her mate and eating him for dinner. No matter how critical we are, we keep hoping to find good. Caught in our Cartesian thinking, we know that humans are evil, but surely then the subjugated, the more than human species are good, are innocent, are ethical, are caring, are relational, and yet relational then is also violent. Are such violences ethical if in the good of larger order and flourishing? How to know the difference when all our lives we are ordered to be a particular way for the greater good, but which good? And right now I am being strangled myself for the good of the university. The punishing bureaucracy, amplified by the Zoom culture of COVID, is increasingly taking hold with its tentacular strangulating hold, invading every space of my body and mind, and more shutting out the light, as if I am lost in a thick kelp forest, wishing to flee, to escape the grasping tethers, to swim into open sea, to swim with and through.
Well, the virus has certainly queered time and made it seem out of joint. Things have galloped along in the world at a rate of knots. The virus skipped borders, travelled on the seas in human hosts and on non-human surfaces. But I have been considering for my chapter with Dorothy how hauntology can help us with non-innocence and complicity. I think the virus has foregrounded privilege much more, which has always been there, but about which we have been able to shut ourselves off. What this virus has done has disrupted the continuity of temporality and also of space. That is why I found Barard's work so apt for this time. Borders which we thought to be there don't exist. The ghosts of apartheid are ever present. When people are evicted from their homes in Durban, and even those in Khayelitsha, who it would seem are being moved so that virus doesn't spread as quickly. Those practices are reminders of a past that has never left us. So what has happened in the world thus far has left markings which are sedimented. Is it our responsibility to find out what has happened so that we may be more accountable and acknowledge our non-innocence? If what we are is our inheritance, then surely we must choose to know about these inheritances or live in a state of oblivion.
Swimming is a life skill that white South African children learnt at school. The beaches were spaces of privileged open access. I grew up in Camps Bay, a little seaside village back then, a white suburb on the Atlantic Ocean that is now one of the trendy tourist destinations in Cape Town. In 1985, I remember the so-called crowd control fences that were erected overnight, whites-only beaches, markers of apartheid violences, of structural enforcement of segregation. Back then, the only people of colour were the ice cream vendors trudging up and down in the baking sun, trying to entice parents to buy.
At times in my research projects, I sense an ambivalence towards me as the owner of the research funds, as a white, middle-class, established academic with power through the largesse of funds and other social privileges. How I always feel both appreciated and yet perhaps disliked and resented for the patronage that is endemic to the professor-student relationship, especially when it is cut across by race and class divides and the particularities of South African histories. When Viv and I wrote the paper on swimming, there was a line that Viv wrote about us as settlers, and my body and heart rebelled and resisted. No, this is not me. My defensive narrative spills out. I am only second-generation South African. I am of Jewish descent. My family arrived as peasants, escaping pogroms and a Holocaust that wiped out any relatives who were not in another distant land. I carry around the sharp image of my great-grandmother and great-aunt, the latter only about 16 years old, standing briefly, breathing hard with fear into cold air, around a mass grave before being shot into it. Me, a settler? No, I'm of refugee stock. My grandmother came out on a boat between the two world wars, and yet Jews became white in many parts of the world and perpetrate these unresolved violences on others and share in the fruits of colonial exploitation and bolster an entire nation state founded on violence. And yes, I need to face the shivering after emerging from the cold sea, the discomforting and uncomfortable bodily quivers that are the result of the threshold encounter, facing myself as settler. A pedagogy of discomfort. Daily I succumb to the powerful urge to swim out into the wildness of freedom, also of death, and return to life and discomfort of my comfort and privilege.
Yesterday, it was hectic trying to get into the pool with the waves crashing, and I realized that the sea is not to be taken for granted or played with, as I was dashed against and on the rock in the middle of the pool, and for a while I couldn't get off it. I felt a bit scared, but eventually managed to clamber or dive off the rock. Someone said that being in the pool when the sea is so wild is like being in a washing machine. I was also thinking about the sewage leak at Fishhook in the sea yesterday due to load shedding, and wondered if it would be possibly reaching us here. It is so distressing what is happening to the sea and how humans think that they can get rid of their debris and shit into the sea and it will just disappear without consequences.
In the time of COVID, the swimming together is especially a balm for the extraordinariness of isolation and the entrapment in home, city, nation state. The swimming and the writing dissolves the alienation. Access is a moment of freedom and community, if only for a stolen moment.
I've been feeling quite dispirited of late, as I feel that there's nothing special to look forward to. The future is so uncertain, we don't know how things will pan out. The first time I got a fright in this way about the precarity of life is during the water shortage in Cape Town. Suddenly the things I took so much for granted were no longer possible. The disconcerting thing about life now is that things are so unpredictable. We are so used to planning our lives and looking forward to this and that, but it doesn't seem possible at the moment with this pandemic. There's been more focus on the human body and the various organs that can be infected. It seems that there are more and more. First it was said to be pneumonia in the lungs, then the kidneys were affected, and one is supposed to need dialysis. Then it emerged that the brain also gets affected. And then it was the COVID toes, which may be purple and look like one has chilblains.
Tremulous times, sitting next to Tammy, who is shaking from the cold. Her fingers are barely able to type. This virus, more than anything, has highlighted how privilege works. Talking to the students on Monday, I recognized how vulnerable they are. Public transport, high-density living, no safe refuge like the house I live in, the car I drive in. I wonder how many of them and or members of their families are already immunocompromised. What will this virus do to social relations? How to be still in all of this uncertainty? How to hold the uncertainty, how to carry it. Ettinger distinguishes containment as fixed and carriance as fluid. It seems to be a better fit. Perhaps that's the difference between the pool and the ocean. Although the pool is tidal, the walls are fixed.
Appreciation is the word that comes to me. The shivers of the last swim in the St. James pool haunted me for days. My vulnerability, the precarity of our embodiment, the pull of the cold like a deep swirling energy that is both irresistible and yet dangerously close to bringing loss of self. The pull of life, the magnetic core to atrophy, the desire to be and the wish not to be. Or is it really the desire to be more fully a part of the all, embraced in the everything, beyond the ugly divides and violences, beyond the individualized and lonely self?
The sea was murky and it was cold in and out. I still enjoyed the silkiness of the water, and the calm breath is strange with swimming. I become more conscious of how I breathe and how I'm afraid of losing my breath and what that means, basically to die. Tammy talks about swimming as an addiction. Is it possible to be addicted to things which are good for you? What I love about swimming in the salt water is the feeling of buoyancy, which is most apparent when I get out. Gravity and my body weight make me suddenly stumble, lose my balance, and walk as if I don't know how to.
Between yesterday and today, there is a merging of my sensibilities, a kind of slippage of time and space and brilliant imagery. The rich and diverse array of colors in Maiden's Pool, a bouquet of exquisite visual gifts from the ocean, psychedelically diffracting through the light, a total trip still washing through me, glittering in moments behind my eyelids. Slow swimming. It can only be slow as one needs to watch, to see, to feel. And the splash is only at the point of our joining a new element, arriving and leaving. A moment of disruption, a moment of troubling the smooth surfaces, of opening up new imaginaries, very old sensations, but shifting the current into something new. Not something we haven't known before in our individual or collective sensibility, but a return and a working moment. The splashes then are our splashes, but we also open ourselves to the splashes already there. The wave crashes over the pool's edge and diffracts across the surface, and we are in that, on the surface and below, and our vision shifts again, new imagery, new openings, new possibilities. In the moments underwater, before my breath leaves me, I am in awe, but I'm also not in my normal disguise. As an individualized entity, it is both scary and exhilarating.
I'm drawn more and more to the word making. It's such a down-to-earth word. It doesn't seem to have the baggage of creating. I think in part it's because it emphasizes the relational. It is inclusive of makers and materials. It's not about the individual creator. I was talking to Viv about the difference between pool swimming and sea swimming, how in the sea the water swims you, it tosses and tumbles us about, whereas in the swimming pool it feels forced. It's all about the body making waves rather than the waves making us. Again, that making word.
I'm wondering why I don't notice colors and scenery on land as I do in the seawater. Maybe it's because the other senses, like sound, are stilled in the water, and the focus is specifically on what is underneath one.
For the last year, I've either been at home, locked down with my family, or somewhere in the sea along the False Bay coast. It's quite discombobulating between being anchored at home and adrift in the sea. When my body is in the water, the space between my body and the water melts away, and the water becomes the space between and the matrix, as in binder or glue, of connection. Or is the water the body of which my body becomes a part? My mind has moved on to our COVID way of life. The sea is safe. It is COVID-free. It has become a refuge, another world that is virus-free. Another thought that has just popped into my head is the difference between the constructed human forms that I see from the coffee shop, Lancet laboratories where people have their COVID tests in a rectilinear building, horizontal, vertical, parallel, words or concepts that have no meaning in the water. There's a different geometry, an organic geometry, topological maths, wild maths.
In the sea, we cannot not be embodied. We are in our body, floating, moving, and vibrantly sensate, both deeply aware of ourself in the sea, yet also melting, seeping into the surrounds, both a body and an entanglement. Different temporality and space, our usual clock time suspended. We are surprised when so many minutes have passed, and we surface questioning the regulated lives we take as normal. We float through kelp, just above the sparking tendrils of anemones and urchins poised to pierce our skin if we are not vigilant. We are never sure what might swim our way. Suddenly a dark, large creature surfaces. It could be a threat, but it is a seal, only playful and curious. In wonder and awe, we face our subjective precarity, but at the same time remember and confront the violences that the seas are implicated in, journeys of death and enslavement, and the violences of the Anthropocene to and in the seas that speak to larger planetary damage. We are empty of thoughts in the ocean, in a meditation of exquisite sensory engagement, and yet thoughts are provoked. Thoughts bubble to the surface.
A highlight for me was finding myself surrounded by thousands of small silver fish, moving in sync with one another, one and all glittering, swaying, shifting, shimmering along. At times they would turn back and swim through each other, like waves diffracting through one another, with minimal effort and no collisions, almost magnetic-like forces, repelling, and therefore never actually touching. I'm hearing Barad again. We never actually touch. There's always that space that is always in between. I wonder what it would be like to write at the beach. I often wish we could linger there longer. We are either in the water or writing on our computer on a table somewhere else. What would it be like to linger in the littoral zone, move between the sea and the beach, our bodies both in and out of the water?
I am grey today after the octopus I was observing for so long. Grey makes one more imperceptible on the page. An octopus move. Although grey is misleading, as 4 octopuses we saw were all such different colours and shapes, becoming with anything they moved towards or what flowed in their paths. At one time the octopus was green and indistinguishable from the kelp, which wrapped around its body. Then the colour of sand, with the tentacles reaching, 1 and then 2, towards sandy-coloured fish. Fish-octopus interaction, coming and going, reaching and darting away. As humans, we always try and make sense or interpret what is happening. How will we ever be sure whether the octopus was hunting the fish, playing with the fish, or engaging in some sort of mutual communication? I got a really good view of how the tentacles work separately, stretching and curling, and also saw one octopus moving its head as if it was eating something. I wonder what they make of these big hulkish humans circling them like sharks, whether it is just a mild irritation, or when the humans come too close, whether they are seen as a threat. Here I am trying to interpret or anthropomorphize the feelings of the octopus just after castigating that type of behavior. But we humans are full of contradictions, swaying this way and that, justifying our moves along the way.
I'm astounded by the rapid changes of colour, the strange dance of tentacles and fish. Who are the fish to the octopus? A potential meal, or an enemy predator, or simply a playmate? Being so close, observing so closely, I have moments of concern that I am abusing the octopus's privacy, harassing them, stalking them.
Camouflage. So often my writing returns to figure and ground. Gestalt, always as visual artist and design teacher, and now more recently, our reading of and thinking with Manning and her students. Haraway says that tentacular comes from Latin meaning to touch, to feel, to try. Watching the octopus number 2 this morning, I noticed how it put out feelers in different directions, the tips of its tentacles gently touching, trying out, sampling the textures, flavors of what they came up against. And there we were, the 3 of us also putting out feelers, trying to reach, to understand the critter that held us captivated.
Water as creator of bonds and relationships. My world is extending, expanding, and morphing further and further through sea swimming. Swimming is extending human relationships. It's also extending my relationship with water, sand, rocks, anemones, sea stars. I'm learning how to avoid the prickles and negotiate my way through and around creatures in the water. I'm also getting a sense of how different the same watery space can be, depending on the tide, the wind, the rain, the sun, the season.
So the anxiety sits in the risk of representation and performativity, how to put across the doing, the embodied learning, the feel of the water on my face as I enter the water, the surrender to the current, the brush of the kelp fronds on my back as I drift along, the pool and the pull of the oceans extending in all directions.